Paradise has a price, and sometimes that price is paid in blood. On the morning of June 14th, housekeeping staff at the Azure Bay Resort discovered a scene that would haunt them forever. Blood splattered across marble floors, shattered glass glinting in the morning sun, and 3 bodies, each telling a different story of violence, betrayal, and desperation. This is the story of a honeymoon that should have been the beginning of a beautiful life together. Instead, it became the stage for unspeakable betrayal. A young bride, her new husband, and his father. 1 week on a tropical island, 1 pregnancy that would expose the darkest of family secrets, and 1 night of violence that would destroy them all. This is not a story about love. This is a story about power, control, and the terrible price of silence.
She was 22 years old when she married into what seemed like a dream. A Filipina nurse working in Manila, she had met her future husband through mutual friends at a hospital charity event. He was kind, educated, and came from a family with means. For a young woman from a modest background, it felt like destiny. Her husband was 28, an only son who had grown up under the shadow of a domineering father. He worked in the family business, lived in a home owned by his father, and had never quite managed to step out from under that controlling influence. Those who knew him described a man caught between wanting independence and craving his father's approval. And then there was the father, 52 years old, a widower who had lost his wife to cancer 3 years earlier, a self-made businessman who built an empire through determination and, some would say, ruthlessness. He was used to getting what he wanted, used to control, used to power, and he was not ready to let go of his son. The wedding was lavish, over 300 guests, a reception that cost more than most people earn in a year. The father spared no expense, though those close to the family noticed something unsettling. He had planned everything, chosen everything. The bride and groom were merely participants in his production. If you want to uncover more chilling true crime stories and see justice exposed, subscribe to Crime Vaults as we bring light to the darkest true crime cases and never miss the secrets hidden in plain sight. For their honeymoon, the couple had dreamed of something simple: a quiet beach, time alone together, a chance to start their marriage away from family expectations and pressures. But the father had other plans. He insisted on an exclusive resort on a private island. He made all the arrangements. He paid for everything. And then he announced he would be joining them. To celebrate properly, he said. To make sure his son and new daughter-in-law had everything they needed. To ensure they were safe in an unfamiliar place. The bride was uncomfortable with the arrangement. She confided in a cousin that it felt wrong, that a honeymoon should be private, that she barely knew this man who would now share what should have been their most intimate week together. But her new husband assured her it would be fine. His father was generous, he said. They should be grateful. It would only be for a few days, he promised. His father would give them space. He was wrong about all of it. The resort was indeed exclusive, accessible only by private boat, luxury villas spread across pristine beaches, staff trained to be invisible, privacy guaranteed. It was the perfect place for a honeymoon. It was also the perfect place for a predator to trap his prey. They arrived on a Monday afternoon. The father had booked 3 villas, all adjacent to each other. His was positioned between the Newlyweds and the main resort facilities. Every path they took, he could see them. Every meal, he insisted on joining them. Every activity, he was there. The bride tried to make the best of it. She smiled through dinners that felt more like business meetings than romantic evenings. She remained polite when the father criticized her choices, her clothes, her English. She said nothing when he ordered for her at restaurants, speaking over her as if she wasn't there. Her husband noticed, but did nothing. This was how his father had always been, he told her.
They just needed to get through the week. After this, they would have their whole lives together. By the third day, the father's behavior had escalated. He began commenting on the bride's appearance, how beautiful she looked in her swimsuit, how lucky his son was to have such an attractive wife, how she reminded him of his late wife when she was young. The words made her skin crawl, but she told herself she was being oversensitive. He was just an older man who didn't understand appropriate boundaries. The father began finding excuses to be alone with her, suggesting his son go for a massage while he kept her company, offering to take her shopping while his son was on a business call the father himself had arranged. Each time, she found ways to avoid being alone with him. Each time, she saw the flash of anger in his eyes when she refused. The groom, exhausted from trying to balance his wife's discomfort and his father's demands, began drinking more than usual. The father encouraged this, constantly refilling his son's glass, suggesting nightcaps, offering expensive whiskey after dinner. It happened on the fifth night. The father had arranged a special dinner, multiple courses, wine with every dish, and for his son, drinks that seemed stronger than they should have been. By 9 o'clock, the groom could barely keep his eyes open. The bride helped him back to their villa, put him to bed, and locked the door behind her.
She showered and changed for bed, grateful to finally have a night alone with her husband, even if he was unconscious. She was drifting off to sleep when she heard the door open. At first, she thought she had forgotten to lock it. Then she saw him, the father, standing in their bedroom doorway. He had a key. Of course he had a key. He had arranged everything. She asked him to leave. He closed the door behind him. She told him his son was sleeping right there. He said he knew. He had made sure of it. She threatened to scream. He laughed and reminded her they were in an isolated villa. The staff had been instructed not to disturb them. No one would come. What happened next would change the course of all their lives. The father did not see his actions as wrong. In his mind, he was entitled to this. He had paid for everything. He had given his son a life. He had accepted this foreign bride into their family. She owed him. They all owed him. The bride fought. She pleaded. She tried to reach her unconscious husband. But the father was stronger, determined, and had planned every detail. When it was over, he warned her what would happen if she told anyone. He would say she had seduced him. He would destroy her reputation. He would have her deported. He would turn his son against her. No one would believe a poor foreign bride over a respected businessman. And he reminded her of what she surely already knew. She was trapped on an island. She had no money of her own. She didn't speak the language of the resort staff. She was completely dependent on him. The next morning, the father acted as if nothing had happened. He greeted them at breakfast with a smile. He suggested activities for the day. He played the role of the doting father perfectly. The bride could barely look at him, could barely eat, could barely function. Her husband, nursing a terrible hangover, noticed she seemed off, but attributed it to the stress of having his father on their honeymoon. He promised again that they would leave soon. But they didn't leave. The father extended their stay. Another 3 days, he announced. He had already arranged it with the resort. They couldn't refuse his generosity, could they? Those 3 days were torture for the bride. She avoided being alone with the father, but his presence was constant. His knowing looks, his subtle touches on her shoulder, her back, her hand, his whispered reminders that she belonged to this family now, that he owned her just as he owned his son. She considered telling her husband, rehearsed the words 100 times, but every time she tried, she saw how he deferred to his father, how he had never once stood up to him, how he had allowed this man to join their honeymoon in the first place. Would he even believe her? Or would he side with his father, the man who had given him everything? The assault replayed in her mind constantly.
The shame, the violation, the powerlessness. She felt dirty, damaged, destroyed, and she was thousands of miles from her family, trapped with her rapist and his oblivious son. When they finally returned home, she thought the nightmare might end. She was wrong. The father had purchased the home where the newlyweds lived. He visited constantly, sometimes daily. He made it clear that he expected the bride to be grateful for his generosity, expected her to keep their secret, expected her to play the role of the dutiful daughter-in-law. 6 weeks after the honeymoon, she missed her period. 2 weeks later, a pregnancy test confirmed what she already feared. She was carrying her father-in-law's child. The bride faced an impossible choice. If she had an abortion, her husband would ask questions. If she kept the pregnancy, she would give birth to living evidence of her rape. Either way, the truth might eventually surface. She decided to keep the pregnancy. Perhaps she hoped the baby would somehow be her husband's despite the timing. Perhaps she couldn't bring herself to end the life growing inside her. Perhaps she simply didn't know what else to do. When she told her husband he was going to be a father, his joy was genuine and heartbreaking. He immediately called his father to share the news. The father's response was carefully measured. Congratulations, how wonderful. He couldn't wait to meet his grandchild. But when he next visited the house and the husband was out of the room, the father made his position clear to the bride. The child was his. She would raise it as her husband's, but the father would always know the truth, and he would make sure she never forgot it either. The pregnancy was difficult. The bride suffered from severe anxiety and depression. She barely ate. She rarely slept. Her husband attributed it to hormones and first-time pregnancy fears. He had no idea his wife was trapped in a living nightmare, carrying the child of her rapist while playing the role of the happy expectant mother. The father became increasingly possessive as the pregnancy progressed. He bought baby clothes. He chose the nursery colors. He insisted on attending doctor's appointments. He reminded everyone, so excited to be a grandfather. But alone with the bride, he made it clear. This was his child, his legacy, his possession. The truth came out at 28 weeks of pregnancy during a routine ultrasound appointment. The doctor was reviewing dates and measurements. The husband mentioned their honeymoon as the likely conception date. The doctor looked at the ultrasound measurements again and frowned. According to the fetal development, conception had occurred approximately 5 to 6 weeks before the date the husband had mentioned. There was a long silence in that examination room. The husband asked the doctor to check again. The doctor did. The measurements were clear. The bride became hysterical, her blood pressure spiking dangerously. The doctor had to stop the appointment and called for assistance. In the hospital corridor, the husband demanded answers. The bride broke down completely. Through tears and panic, the truth poured out. The assault, the threats, the months of silence and terror, the father's continued abuse and control. The initial reaction was disbelief. Not his father, not the man who had given him everything. There had to be another explanation. The bride must have been with someone else. She must be lying. But the dates didn't lie. And as the initial shock faded, the husband began remembering details he had ignored or explained away. His strange illness that night on the honeymoon, his father's insistence on having keys to their villa, the way his father looked at his wife, the way she flinched when the father touched her, the change in her after the honeymoon, the fear in her eyes whenever his father visited. The husband's denial turned to rage, not at his father yet, but at the situation, at the violation of his marriage, at the child that wasn't his, at his wife for not telling him sooner. He couldn't process who the real villain was. Not yet. The father arrived at the hospital, alerted by the doctor's office about the emergency. He found his son in the waiting room and immediately knew something had changed. The husband confronted him. The father denied everything, called the bride a liar, an opportunist, a foreign woman who had trapped his son and was now trying to destroy their family. But the timeline was undeniable, and the father made a critical mistake. In his anger at being confronted, He let his mask slip. He said things that only someone who had been there that night would know. Details about the villa, about his son being asleep, about being alone with the bride. The husband's world collapsed in that moment. His father, his hero, the man he had spent his entire life trying to please, was a rapist, had drugged him, had assaulted his wife, had been manipulating them both for months. The hospital released the bride later that evening with medication to manage her blood pressure and strict instructions to avoid stress. The husband took her home. The father followed, insisting they needed to discuss this as a family. What followed was not a discussion. It was a breakdown of decades of dysfunction, control, and abuse. The father attempted to explain himself. In his twisted logic, he had done nothing wrong. The bride was part of their family. What was theirs was his. He had needs. He had rights. His son owed him everything, including understanding. The husband, torn between a lifetime of conditioning to obey his father and the horror of what had been done to his wife, spiraled between rage and confusion. He shouted at both of them, at his father for the betrayal, at his wife for not telling him sooner, at himself for being too weak to protect her. The bride, exhausted and emotionally destroyed, tried to leave, to go to her family, to anywhere but that house with those men. But the father blocked the door. This was still his house, he reminded them. They lived here because of him. The child she carried was his blood. They would resolve this as a family. The situation was a powder keg. 3 people trapped together. 1 victim, 1 rapist, and 1 man who didn't know whether to choose his wife or his father. The father made the choice for him. In his arrogance and need for control, he said the words that would prove fatal. He told his son that he had been weak his entire life, that he would never be man enough to run the family business, that he couldn't even satisfy his own wife, which was why the father had to step in, that the child in her belly was probably stronger than any child his weak son could have produced. Something broke in the husband at those words. Years of belittlement, a lifetime of never being enough, the violation of his marriage, the betrayal of everything he had believed about his father. All of it crystallized into pure rage. What happened next was captured partially by a security camera the father had installed to watch over his investment. The footage shows the exact moment when words turned to violence. The husband lunged at his father, years of repressed anger erupting all at once. They crashed into furniture. The father, older but experienced in physical confrontation from his youth, fought back viciously. They were evenly matched in their rage. The bride screamed for them to stop. She tried to call the police, but the father knocked the phone from her hand. She attempted to get between them and was shoved backward, hitting the wall hard. At 28 weeks pregnant, any fall was dangerous. The husband saw his wife fall, and his rage doubled. He grabbed a lamp from the side table. The father grabbed a marble bookend. They were no longer just fighting, they were trying to kill each other. The bride, injured and terrified, knew she had to stop this. She ran to the kitchen. Behind her, she could hear the sickening sounds of violence, thuds, crashes, the grunts of men inflicting and receiving pain. She returned with a knife, not to use, she would later tell investigators, just to threaten, just to make them stop, just to protect herself and her unborn child. But when she entered the room, she saw her husband on the floor, the father standing over him, the marble bookend raised high, blood already streaming down her husband's face. What happened in the next 30 seconds is disputed. The father claims the bride attacked him without provocation. The bride claims the father turned on her, knife or no knife. The security footage is unclear due to the angle.
If you want to uncover more chilling true crime stories and see justice exposed, subscribe to Crime Vaults as we bring light to the darkest true crime cases and never miss the secrets hidden in plain sight. What is clear is that the knife ended up in the father's abdomen. The father, wounded but enraged, grabbed the bride by the throat. The husband, barely conscious, got to his feet and struck his father from behind.
The father released the bride and turned on his son one final time. They went down together, father and son, in a final, terrible embrace. The father's hands around his son's throat, the son's hands trying to break free, both of them bleeding, both of them broken. The bride pulled the father off her husband. In doing so, she twisted the knife that was still embedded in the father's abdomen. He collapsed. For a moment, there was silence. Then came the sirens. A neighbor, hearing the screams, had called the police. First responders arrived to a scene of carnage. 3 victims, blood everywhere. A young woman, visibly pregnant, in shock, unable to speak coherently. 2 men, both critically injured. The father died in the ambulance en route to the hospital. The knife wound, combined with internal injuries from the fight, had caused massive internal bleeding. He was 52 years old. The husband survived, but with severe injuries, a fractured skull, broken ribs, internal bleeding. He would spend 2 weeks in intensive care and 3 months in physical rehabilitation. The head injuries would affect his memory of that night, some details forever lost to trauma and concussion. The bride went into premature labor from the stress and trauma. At 28 weeks, the baby boy was born via emergency cesarean section. He weighed 2 pounds and 11 ounces. He would spend 73 days in the neonatal intensive care unit fighting for every breath. The bride was arrested at the hospital 2 days after giving birth, charged initially with murder. The investigation, however, would reveal a far more complicated truth. The trial took 18 months to begin. In that time, investigators pieced together the full story. Medical records confirmed the assault timeline. Hotel staff, once pressed, admitted they had been instructed by the father to ignore any noises from the Newlywed villa. Text messages on the father's phone revealed his obsession with his daughter-in-law and his detailed planning of the assault. The husband, once he recovered, stood by his wife. He testified about his father's controlling behavior, about waking up that night on the honeymoon with no memory of how he got to bed, about the drugs later found in his system, about the months of his wife's suffering that he had been too blind to see. The bride was ultimately charged with manslaughter, not murder. The prosecution acknowledged her history as a sexual assault victim, acknowledged the ongoing abuse, acknowledged that she had been defending herself and her husband in the final confrontation. She was sentenced to 4 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 2. The judge acknowledged the complexity of the case, acknowledged that this young woman had been victimized long before she ever picked up that knife. But a man was dead, and the law required consequences. The husband was not charged. Investigators determined he had acted in self-defense throughout the altercation. The child, that baby boy born 2 months too early and into tragedy, survived. He was placed in the custody of the bride's family while she served her sentence. DNA testing confirmed what everyone already knew. The father was indeed the biological grandfather and father. The child was the product of rape. This case shocked the nation and sparked conversations that many people found uncomfortable, about sexual assault within families, about the vulnerability of immigrant brides in marriages where power is unequal, about the silence that protects predators and destroys victims. Statistics tell us that the bride situation is not as rare as we might hope. 1 in 4 women will experience sexual violence in their lifetime. In 70% of cases, the perpetrator is someone the victim knows, family members, friends, people who use their position of trust and power to victimize those who are vulnerable. Immigrant women are particularly at risk. Language barriers, fear of deportation, isolation from support systems, and economic dependence create the perfect conditions for abuse. When the abuser is also the financial provider, the one who controls housing and documentation, escape becomes nearly impossible. The bride exhibited all the classic signs of ongoing trauma and abuse: depression, anxiety, difficulty eating and sleeping, avoidance behaviors, hypervigilance. But because she had no support system, no one who knew what to look for, she suffered in silence. Her husband, despite being present, saw nothing. This is also common. Abusers are skilled at hiding their true nature. They present one face to the world and another to their victims. They manipulate and gaslight. They make their victims believe no one will help them, believe them, or care. The father's behavior fits a clear pattern of a sexual predator. He targeted someone vulnerable. He isolated her. He used his power and position to trap her. He planned and executed his assault. And he continued to abuse her afterward, secure in his belief that his power would protect him from consequences. Today, the bride has served her sentence and been released. She lives quietly with her son, who is now 5 years old. She has undergone extensive therapy and is slowly rebuilding her life. She has become an advocate for immigrant women in abusive situations, using her story to help others find the courage to speak up before tragedy strikes. The husband divorced her while she was in prison, unable to reconcile the trauma of that night with the possibility of a future together. He has since remarried and has no contact with the child from that tragic honeymoon. Some wounds, it seems, cut too deep to heal. The child knows only that his mother loves him. The full truth of his conception and the violence of his birth will be shared with him when he is older, when he can understand, when he can process the complexity of being born from violence but raised in love.
This story has no heroes, only victims and survivors. A young woman who married into what she thought was a better life and found only nightmare. A young man who loved his father too much to see him clearly. And a baby born into chaos who had no choice in any of it. The warning signs were there, the controlling behavior, the boundary violations, the isolation, the excessive generosity that was actually a form of control. If even one person had recognized these signs and intervened, 3 lives might not have been destroyed. If you or someone you know is experiencing sexual assault or domestic violence, there is help available. The National Sexual Assault Hotline is available 24 hours a day at 1-800-656-HOPE. You are not alone. You are not to blame. And there is a way out, even when it feels impossible. In the end, this story is a reminder that evil does not always look like a monster. Sometimes it wears the face of a father, a provider, a pillar of the community. And sometimes the only difference between surviving and becoming a statistic is finding the courage to speak the truth, even when that truth could destroy everything you thought you knew. The young bride found that courage, but she found it too late, and the price was paid in blood, trauma, and broken lives. This has been the true story of a honeymoon betrayal that ended in bloody tragedy, a cautionary tale about power, control, and the terrible cost of silence. If you want to uncover more chilling true crime stories and see justice exposed, subscribe to Crime Vaults as we bring light to the darkest true crime cases and never miss the secrets hidden in plain sight.